Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of WorkRise. My name is Parag Mehta, and I have the great privilege of serving as the Executive Director of the Center for Inclusive Growth, which is the philanthropic arm of MasterCard. We are so thrilled to be one of the founding partners of this exciting new Research to Action collaborative that's going to help us make meaningful progress in moving people in the United States from low and middle wage jobs to better jobs of the future. 12 years ago, I had the opportunity to serve on a presidential transition team for Barack Obama. We were starting our work 2 months after the biggest global meltdown in our economy and the worst recession of our lifetimes. And I remember that during that transition, somebody handed me a copy of a book written by Frances Perkins. She was the Secretary of Labor during the Great Depression, the first woman to ever serve in a presidential cabinet. And the book told the story of how Frances Perkins, during this great economic crisis, helped put 8 million people back to work through government-sponsored jobs. And what she said was that it wasn't enough for people to be working shovel-ready jobs, like building roads and highways and doing construction of libraries and public theaters, but she also wanted to build on the intellectual capital, funding arts and education. She understood that this was a means of keeping people's skills sharp so that when the economy improved and when good jobs became available again, we would have a workforce that was ready for it. Today, we find ourselves in a similar situation. We have a massive global recession about to begin. We have millions of people out of work or displaced. And we have changing technology that was already disrupting the workforce even before the COVID pandemic. And so our job is to think about how do we make that future smoother? Because the truth of the matter is that the future of work has become the present of workers. And that is why we are so excited to partner with the Urban Institute and our colleagues from the Gates Foundation, from Walmart, the Cognizant Foundation, and Casey Foundation to support this incredible collaborative that's really going to put practitioners and policymakers in a room together to figure out how do we make meaningful progress in moving vulnerable workers into better jobs. So before we get started, I want to share a little bit of housekeeping with everyone. First, you should all know that today's conversation is being recorded, and that recording will be posted on the WorkRise website. Secondly, all of you are muted at this moment, but we encourage you to participate in the conversation. Please share your questions and your comments using the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And finally, we hope that what's said here doesn't stay here. Please share the work of this conversation on social media, on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and use the hashtag WorkRise. That's WorkRise, one word, capital W, capital R. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce somebody who has become a terrific friend and my sister from another mister over at the Walmart Foundation. Gayatri Agnew is a senior director helping to lead Walmart's philanthropic efforts, and she has been a terrific partner in setting up WorkRise. And I'm so glad she's going to help lead this conversation today about how do we leverage skills and make the job search and job placement process better. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Gayatri Agnew.
Thank you so much, Parag. And it's true, I think one of the unseen impacts of the launch of WorkRise has already been the amount of collaboration that's begun amongst those of us, Parag, myself, and many others who have helped to bring this effort to life. Walmart and Walmart Foundation are incredibly humbled and honored to have been a part of launching this effort. We have a phenomenal panel in store for you today. I'm thrilled to welcome our panel to the digital stage, and I'll introduce everybody one by one here. So first, let's join in welcoming Peter Blair. Peter is faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I have gotten to know Peter primarily on Twitter, but fortunately a little bit on digital screen in more recent events. He co-directs the project on workforce at Harvard Graduate School of Education. He also serves as a faculty research fellow with the National Bureau of Economic Research. So welcome, Peter. We're so glad you're here. Next up, we have Mary Alice McCarthy, who's the director of the Center on Education and Labor at New America. And Mary Alice's work examines the intersection of higher education, workforce development, and labor policies. She's previously worked both in the Department of Education and Department of Labor. Thrilled to have you here with us as well. And next up, Kristen Titus. Kristen is the executive director of the Cognizant US Foundation, which supports those working to develop, educate, and train the workforce both of today and tomorrow. Kristen's previously served as New York's Chief Technology and Innovation Officer and was the founding executive director for Girls Who Code. And lastly, David Zamello is executive director for the San Antonio-based Project Quest. Quest is a nonprofit organization which is working in workforce development to provide resources and comprehensive support services for those who are underemployed and unemployed, moving adults to living wage employment. Prior to his leadership of Project Quest, David was with USAA for 30 years and had a distinguished career there. So this is an incredible panel that I think brings for us really unique and different perspectives on skills. So let's jump right in. I'll start, the premise of skills and work is very simple. People have skills, employers have jobs, and so we just pop the people with the right skills into the right jobs and call it a day. So panel, help me understand why it is slightly more complicated than that. What I'd love to ask each of you to do, and Peter, we'll start with you, is just share a little bit with us about how you think about skills and matching in our labor market if the aspiration that we are collectively seeking is greater economic mobility for workers. So Peter, we'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody that's joining in over the live stream. I want to start by saying one of the surprising features of the US labor market has been the divergence in the real wages that are earned by workers with college degrees and those without. So those with college degrees have experienced tremendous wage growth, whereas those without college degrees have experienced tremendous wage stagnation. And one of the projects that I'm deeply engaged in with Opportunity at Work is how do we think about the skills that workers who have high school diplomas but not college degrees, what are the skills that they bring to the labor market? And what are the ways in which they are going to be learning on the job? And the reason why we want to focus on this particular population is because they represent 70 million Americans, right, who've experienced stagnant wages. And our premise is quite simple. It's really, if we can find ways to understand how workers without college degrees are learning on the job, and we can reward them for the skills, that could potentially close the gap between the demand for skilled workers and the supply of skilled workers that we're currently facing in the US labor market. So it's really about redefining like what we think of as skilled work and how we think about workers as getting skills, not just through college degrees, but thinking about workers who are skilled through alternative routes, or as we call them at Opportunity at Work, STARS.
Peter, thank you so much. Mary Alice, do you mind going next? Just share a little bit with us about your view of that challenge.
I'd love to, and thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to all the folks. Thank you to WorkRise. This is a really exciting initiative and so much needed. And you know, in answer to the question, I would sort of, similar to Peter, would say that in many ways, it's not a shortage of skills that is the problem in the United States and that's thwarting economic mobility. But we do clearly have a problem with economic mobility in the United States, and it is declining. And why is that? And I would say that the problem is less a problem of skills and skills development and systems for developing skills than it is a problem of job quality. So to your point, Gayatri, we have workers who have skills, and then we have employers who have jobs. And where things are breaking down is really on the quality of those jobs that are available to people, particularly workers without a bachelor's degree. That's where we see a decline in the wages, we see a decline in the security of those jobs, we see a decline in the availability of benefits for those jobs. That's where we really see tremendous wage stagnation and in some cases even wage decline. So I think this is a really difficult thing because it's sort of a bedrock belief in the United States that the key to economic mobility is through education and through school. It's incredibly important for our social cohesion as a country that we live up to that social contract and we restore that connection. I think, and I'll go into these in more detail, I won't do them now, but I see sort of three big buckets that we are focusing on here at the Center on Education and Labor of how do we restore the relationship between education, skills training, and economic mobility. And the first revolves around strengthening our labor laws. And I know that has been the focus of some of your other panels, but it's often missing from conversations around skills development and workforce development. And we believe it really needs to be at the center of it because you can't do one without the other. You can't get a return from your skills if you don't have power in the workplace. The second just big bucket is around how we finance and hold accountable our post-secondary education and training providers. We have just increasingly relied on debt financing, and this is just a disaster, and it is probably one of the single biggest causes of rising inequality and the growing racial wealth gap. And then the third is the need to strengthen labor market institutions. And here I'm talking about organizations like Project Quest and other types of workforce intermediaries, as well as unions and just work organizations that can mediate between low-wage workers, job seekers, and the labor market and employers. Happy to go into more of those as needed in the future. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Mary Alice. David, let's go to you.
Sure, and again, pleasure to be here with everyone this afternoon. As great setup, Mary Alice. I think when I look at the matching and the connection as we're talking about workers and jobs and skills, it really, to me, is a pipeline type discussion. Do you have jobs that are there by employers? You have workers with skills. But to me, the bigger issue and challenge is the connection, the systemic connection of understanding those skills to the various training institutions that help develop those skills. And then what are the raw skills coming from the front end of the pipeline of the workers? And when you talk about low income workers, they may be at a deficit of certain basic skills. So as we manage a pipeline and look at the matching of it, is how do you take and understand what those skills are and translate those into what the various training programs and apparatuses are to help develop those skills. And there's two sides to that. There is the technical skills side of it, of becoming an accountant or a tradesperson. But to me, the bigger issue, especially when you're talking about economic mobility and moving people through to match the jobs, is the other side of the equation. We'll call them the soft skills, the transferable skills, because in today's environment, you have to be able to adapt and learn and adjust. So a training program itself is not the end point for someone to create that skill set for economic mobility. That's the beginning point, as I think someone mentioned. They're going to learn on the job. So low-income workers and the basic core skills of adaptability, being able to learn, are prerequisites to be able to be successful in that matching process, because you'll learn the technical parts through your training program or on the job. But does the system help prepare someone that has the full set of skills going forward? And I think, to me, that the matching part is looking at the two ends, but what's happening in the middle of the process to acquire those skills. And so from a Quest standpoint, we do step in as an intermediary and navigate that pipeline process to make sure that the soft skills, the technical skills match up, and we understand the employer's needs, where the gaps are from the worker standpoint, and help them close those. So it's really, to me, a systemic type discussion as you think about the matching process between those low-income workers and mobility and where the jobs are.
Appreciate that, David. Kristen, let's go over to you.
Yes, thank you, Gayatri, and thank you to Urban and the WorkRise team. Cognizant's so thrilled to help support this initiative, truly more important than ever. Gayatri, when you ask about skills and matching, really, I think we oftentimes talk about a skills gap, but we really think there's a pathways gap. And by that, I mean there are millions and millions of people willing to do whatever it takes to fill the jobs that are open today. They just don't know what steps to take. And really, when we talk about skills gap, that puts the onus on the workers to fix a problem, when I think the responsibility really extends beyond that. When we think about how to address that, really, it takes employers, policymakers, educational institutions to come together and define clear pathways into a job and entry points into those jobs with which to align all of our work. And I think that is the challenge for us today as the economy is evolving amidst COVID. How do we do that now? And how do we leverage to today's discussion, WorkRise, to really support us in doing that?
Okay, I love this, and be warned, I told the panel I would try not to surprise them, but just hearing all of those answers, I do have a question that's not in the script, because all of you mentioned in a very direct way the system, right? You talked about actors in the system, but then you also talked about the system itself. So I'd love to hear if anyone wants to chime in with a quick perspective on what about that system is working for workers right now, and what about that system could work better or differently.
I can jump in there, Gayatri. I'm really excited to hear the perspectives of everybody that's here. And in a lot of ways, like we really should think about the US labor market and also the market for education and skills as being an ecosystem of interconnected actors, right? In some sense, like a huge input into a worker's ability to do work is the training. Some of that training is going to come from your high school, it's going to come from your community college, it's going to come from your university. Some of that also is going to happen on the job. If we have a student that graduates from Harvard Law School, that person is going to go to a law firm and they're going to learn how to make briefs at the law firm. And so in a lot of ways, education can be a ticket into having access to the ability to train. And so we have to really understand like what's the respective role that employers have, both in terms of like sourcing workers, but also in terms of skilling them up for what their next job is going to be, which has to do with Kristen's point about like having a pathways problem. And then Alice's point in terms of really thinking about like the way in which education has been pathway for mobility. We have to really think as educational institutions, what is it that we need to do? And one of the things that I've enjoyed so much about the work that I've done with Opportunity at Work as a researcher, and also the work that I've done with the Harvard Project on Workforce, is that we're actively convening researchers, we're actively convening workers who are stars, we're actively convening employers to really start to think about like, what is the respective roles that each of us play in terms of making sure that these handoffs are seamless?
I appreciate that, Peter. Yeah, I think as WorkRise was being conceived, a table at which the various actors could sit together and have conversations like what you were just articulating, Peter, is definitely an aspiration. Mary Alice, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to double down on what Peter was saying, and that really we have many systems of worker preparation and workforce development and education in the system in the United States. And what I would say is that some parts of their system are severely underbuilt, and they could be built up more. And that's something I would love to see WorkRise, sort of get involved in. And it's like we have a pretty highly developed higher education system and post-secondary education system, and that's where we do put a lot of resources, both individual resources and public resources. But we have other historic systems like our national apprenticeship system, our other parts of our economic development system that are being currently under leveraged in significant ways, and that in particular states and cities could probably be using better, that need to be updated through policies, but that we need to be thinking more about. And these are systems, I think, that could do a better job at really at delivering some of the education and training we want to see that happens on the job, that is much more secure, that's paid, and that also can be more effective at addressing issues like equity and lack of diversity within particular occupations. And these are systems that we should really be thinking about using better, and be happy to talk about that more, as would be helpful.
Oh, go ahead, David, please.
I was just going to pick up on that point because you're both have hit on, I think, the core discussion that I really wanted to bring to the forefront. Then you're looking at different populations. So as I said, our secondary education and pursuing degrees, I think that is pretty well defined. But when I think about workforce development and the subject we're talking about here, I think we're really talking about at least the adult learner who is in a situation that is pivoting, looking to reskill, and the traditional pathway of an associate's degree or bachelor's degree may not be the pathway for them to get those particular skills. And what I've seen, and what I've become more of a proponent of, is seeing what I would call these boot camp style or skills-based training programs that adult learners can get into, acquire the skills to be proficient, and using a very easy example of IT fundamentals or certain coding boot camps, you acquire that core skill and you complement that with the job readiness or soft skills. You get somebody job ready. And I think that is a big piece of this discussion that we sometimes, at least in the circles I travel, we don't talk as much about, because we talk about it more in a traditional sense of kids coming through high school, going into college, and then moving through from a workforce development standpoint. But I think the bigger issues is we're talking about the reskilling. And so the investment in the alignment of some of these other non-traditional type programs, I think, fit a key need, especially going forward when you're talking about trying to operate at the speed of business, and where businesses are trying to fill certain positions. These adult learners, you have a chance to get them job ready in a more real-time fashion. So the idea of the non-traditional boot camp style type programs for the adult learners seems to have a real opportunity. And I know it gets into the apprenticeship piece of it, which I'm a big fan of also, where you earn and learn and pay at the same time. I think those are really the kind of ideas that help facilitate some of the issues that we're seeing. And I think, again, WorkRise as an entity to be able to tease out those opportunities and drive investment into programs like that is why WorkRise was created in the first place.
Appreciate that, David. Kristen?
If I can offer two things. We've already used this language quite a lot here, intermediaries, alignment. And I think when we talk about the system as it exists today, we have to recognize that we are working in an economy with a set of jobs that are ever evolving, and the skills and competencies required for those jobs are hard for even the employers to articulate quarter by quarter. So the extent to which we can align all academic institutions, training and education providers, workforce development entities to what employers don't even know is quite the challenge. And I think part of the question that we are hoping WorkRise to answer in this is, who plays that role, and how do we present and build a system that can evolve as the needs evolve for the economy as a whole. The second thing I'll offer, building on what Peter mentioned in the Opportunity at Work STARS report, is a bit of a tangent here, but a worthwhile note, and that is the 70 million Americans that Peter mentioned cannot be identified in the labor market right now. They are largely visible because we are defining people by their educational attainment, and that is inherently flawed, and why it's hard for us to even build strategies to address a population that is, I mean, truly 70 million people. That's outstanding.
Yeah. And if I can just jump in for a bit there, Kristen, you're absolutely right. That's one of the reasons why, you know, my partners at Opportunity at Work and I feel really strongly about thinking about how can we reimagine quantifying the skills that folks who don't have bachelor's degrees already have, right? Because we learn so much through work experience. And even for folks who may not be in the labor market, like take, for example, like a mom or a dad who's staying at home, like balancing the checkbook, like running the house, like that requires a tremendous amount of managerial skills, right? But in some sense, we might look at that person and say, they're not skilled because they don't have a degree or they don't have the relevant work experience too. And I'll tie in with one other point that you made, which is that we have to see ourselves both as recipients of people, but also we have to see ourselves as being like folks who are going to empower them to go to what their next jobs look like. We can't just be end consumers of talent and skills, but we also have to be developers and builders of skills, whether we are workforce partners or whether we are educational institutions as well too. And I think there's a way in which we need to latch on to that sense of a social obligation that we have to our workers or our learners, and also the social obligation that we have to other actors in the ecosystem in terms of, to the extent that I'm receiving a worker or a student from another place who has been trained by them, I should want to pay it forward and help to scale up the people that I have to, and freely release them to go to higher opportunities for like earning greater wages.
Appreciate that context, Peter. Now I will return to our regularly scheduled programming and ask the question I was supposed to ask second, which I think is a critical lens to apply to the way you guys are each thinking about this, which is, you know, up until this year, we talked a lot about the future of work and how technology was changing and is changing jobs. And then we have this global pandemic come in and disrupt an enormous amount of the global economy, and in particular, the US economy, right? Projections as high as 40 to 45% of jobs lost may not return. Then you also layer in a reckoning this nation is having with how to manage equity and the pursuit of greater racial equity within our culture, but also specifically within our workplaces. And so just ask each of you to sort of, how do the events of this year impact how we should or how we could think about defining skills for workers and defining that process of matching those workers to jobs? And Kristen, can we start with you?
Sure. It's so funny when you premise this with what's happened in the last year. So much has happened in the last year that has required us to turn this entire field upside down. You know, 42% of jobs lost in COVID are estimated to never come back. That obviously disproportionately impacts Black and Latinx workers. That is real. And I think if we were to simply return to the playbook of 12 months ago, we recognize that we are not meeting workers where they are. Someone who has been out of a job since March cannot take 6 months off of work without pay, without childcare, to take a boot camp, right? And hope that they get a job in 6 months. These traditional models aren't going to work. We have to look deeper into how we fund wraparound services and leverage federal and philanthropic and corporate funds to do that. We have to look at how we expand OJT, on the job training funding. We really have to think critically about where the worker is today and how best to support them, and really bring everyone together around this. We only have one chance.
Mary Alice, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, happy to. It's such a great question, and it's just it has been so sobering and so upsetting. The pandemic has really sort of ripped off any sort of veneer we had around our labor market and who it's working for and who it's not. We know this is a recession that is just hammering low-wage workers. It's becoming more and more concentrated, its effect on low-wage workers, who are the workers who are least able to weather a recession. These are the workers who are the least likely to have a bachelor's degree, which we know is also associated with faster reemployment rates. And so these are workers too who we know that they were also the workers who are having the hardest time accessing our social insurance systems that should be there to help them in this critical time. Low-wage workers are more likely to be independent workers, and independent workers have a harder time accessing unemployment insurance benefits. They're also low-wage workers are less likely to have paid leave and to have health insurance. So everything about this crisis has pointed to, like, we have a serious job quality issue in the lower wages of in the lower echelons of our labor market, and these workers are just literally one paycheck away potentially from personal bankruptcy. I'll also say the pandemic has really shown us that many of our most vulnerable students are being disproportionately affected. Community college students are dropping out at higher rates than other groups of students, and African American and Latinx young people and adults are disproportionately represented among community college students. So everything about this pandemic has just sort of revealed the stark inequities that they do follow along racial and ethnic fissures that already exist, and that we have a lot of work to do to rebuild the economy in a way that addresses these systemic inequities.
Appreciate that, Mary Alice. David or Peter?
Sure, I'll follow up.
Unmuted, so you get to go next.
And so just to really build on Mary Alice's point there, the other spotlight that has really been cast upon this is the digital divide and just pure accessibility. I mean, let's get to the basics of, as we go forward right now, lower income workers or people in certain life situations will not have the basic access to the resources to upskill at this point in time. And as you think about the changing landscape where we have pivoted to more of an online look for a job type environment, present your skill sets, interview, onboard, and I think that is something that has evolved over the last 6 months, and I think it's going to be with us for a while. It's changed the game of how you actually do the search and matching for a job. And you take and look at low-income workers or individuals that don't have basic broadband access or don't even have the equipment or tools to gain access. How do they first develop the skills, or how do they present themselves to even compete for the jobs? And so I think the pandemic has put a spotlight on that. So when we talk about systemic changes or opportunities, creating that equality of accessibility, to me, is almost one of the key starting points to give someone an opportunity to even get on the road to recovery or get on that pathway. And I think that we're here in San Antonio, we're certainly making a concerted effort to invest in portions of our population so they can gain the basic accessibility and tools to develop the skills, to understand what the jobs are, and put them on that particular pathway.
Thanks, David. All right, Peter.
Yeah, I appreciate everything that you all have said in terms of like the ways in which COVID-19 has been a tremendous labor market disruption. And then we layer on top of that the public health implications of that in terms of like most people have been touched by this crisis. I think in terms of the US population, it's like 1 in 2,000 Americans like have passed, right? And when you look at African Americans, that's like 1 in 1,000. So that's pretty striking. One of my cousins passed from COVID. And so it's like, this is like very personal in terms of like the public health dimension to it. And we add a third axis, which is like George Floyd's very brutal and very public murder, which I think in a lot of ways like sensitized so many people in America to just the day-to-day indignities and injustices that Black people face in the United States of America. And that third part was like incredibly personal for me as a Black man walking around. People don't see my degrees from Harvard and Duke and the College of the Bahamas. You know, they don't see my research. They see this, right? And I started to think like really deeply about what is it in this moment that I could do as a Black man and as a scholar and as someone who's really interested in thinking about workforce development. And one of the silver linings behind this was that a lot of folks in corporate America, C-suite executives, got incredibly activated by George Floyd's very brutal murder. I mean, you had CEOs of Fortune 500 companies committing like billions of dollars towards like racial equity. JP Morgan recently announced, I think it was like $10 billion that they're gonna commit. The Brooklyn Nets came up with a social justice platform. We just see corporate America is activated in a way that's really unique in terms of responding to the labor market crisis, the public health crisis, and the racial justice crisis. And so something that we have to really think about is how do we use this particular moment to really, in a very fundamental way, change the way that we think about how the US labor market works and operationally how we fundamentally reformat who it works for. And very concretely, we have to change the way that we think about who is skilled versus who's not skilled, because oftentimes like that is the dividing line between who actually even gets to apply for a job based on whether there's a college degree requirement or not. And then secondly, who gets to build skills by having access to that job and to the pathways, Kristen, that you mentioned. And when we think about the extent to which access to higher education in the United States has been particularly closed off to many African Americans, you know, in some sense, like extra college requirements for jobs further embeds that same racial inequality that we've historically been grappling with. And this was one of the reasons why, you know, one of my colleagues, Shad Ahmed at Opportunity at Work, and I penned a piece that was in the Wall Street Journal to really say, what is it that Fortune 500 companies can do to respond to racial injustices? Yes, we want you to put money towards this issue, but in a very fundamental way, you can change the way in which the labor market functions for people who don't have college degrees, and particularly how it functions for Black workers. And we think that this could be for the betterment of the US. And so let's make sure that in this moment where a lot of these fissures in the labor market, the public health infrastructure, and the way in which we think about racial justice, as all of these things are being exposed, let us really use this opportunity to reconfigure the fundamental kind of like anatomy of the social contract in the US.
I like that, Peter, that the anatomy of the social contract in the US really resonates. You know, I think all said a version of skills are relevant or skills are necessary, but not sufficient, perhaps, to rise to solving, Kristen, you put it as a pathways gap, which I think is a really compelling way to think about how we enable mobility, which is the goal behind WorkRise. Curious if each of you could sort of comment or share an example of something you don't know, right? We've pulled you together because you're a group of experts, but one of the goals of WorkRise is to really find the space that exists in between the things we know definitively and the open questions that we have to build a stronger shared evidence space to make meaningful progress on economic mobility in the United States. And so just wondering if each of you could comment on or give an example of something you don't know or how you see WorkRise being able to play a meaningful role in unlocking perhaps some open questions around this issue of skills and matching. And then for those watching, please do drop your questions into the Q&A. I see a number of them there. We're going to shift shortly into audience questions. And so let's see, who wants to start?
I'll jump in.
David's ready.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so great question. And I think as I've had a chance to work with the WorkRise board, the question to me is where I mentioned earlier is how do we create the alignment and how can WorkRise influence? How do we create the alignment to all of the actors and players, whether it's the employers, the training institutions, and the other agencies that deal with people that are seeking these kind of opportunities? And so to me, in my mind's eye, I see it as still the biggest challenge. Individually, you can have different training programs or partners in their own right doing a great job. employers can do a better job of potentially articulating what their skills are. Individuals can be ready, willing, and able to step into a process and acquire those skills. But to me, the unknown is, how do you create the alignment where the actors willfully align to, so they take their own greater good and really make that secondary, and then for the bigger picture, they align their services to that system we're talking about. So I see that as a challenge. The question in my mind is, how do you make that work where people kind of step into it willfully? And I'm talking about all the actors across that pipeline that we were talking about earlier, is to me the biggest question in my mind, and hopeful that the work we do with WorkRise can influence and help create that collaborative kind of framework that I think is necessary to really make workforce development work.
Appreciate that, David. Mary Alice, go ahead. Oh,
Kristen, it sounded like you were about to say something, so if you want to go first, I'm happy to go after you.
Sure, perfect. I think we're circling around some of the same ideas here, which is a great sign. I'll build on something Peter said, which is that everyone from corporate America to your neighbor wants to solve this problem. We are here to help. We feel the weight of years of systemic challenges, of systemic racism. We are here and we are ready to answer that call. To David's point, I think what WorkRise can really do that no one has yet done is, what is the role of the employer? What is the role of policymaker? What is the role of the worker? And what is the role of the education and training institution? And how do we align all of those? Because we are all here at the ready. What is our role, and how do we create a system by which we work together, not just now, but seamlessly, well into the future?
appreciate that, Kristen. Mary Alice.
I was going to just build on that, because that's exactly, Kristen, I was going to sort of build on a similar point, which is to get into that question. I'd love WorkRise to be able to get into that question of how do we understand employer decision-making around here? How do we influence it better? In particular, how do we influence the time horizons that employers think about in terms of their commitments to employees and their willingness to sort of do on-the-job training and sort of longer sort of development processes? How do we, who are the kinds of employers and why who are willing to build internal career ladders? What makes employers or businesses stop building internal career ladders? And how can we think about the policies that might sort of stop that process? Because we really need those internal career ladders to support economic mobility so that people can move from an entry-level job up the firm. I think we need a better understanding and really a sort of a, not to be too provocative, but like a really like frank, candid understanding of what, you know, what are the costs and benefits as employers see them? What sort of pressures are on them, whether it's from shareholders or whether it's from boards, who is it from? Because over the last several decades in the United States, we've seen tremendous emphasis on cost cutting of labor costs from the employer community, and that makes things like apprenticeship and sort of on-the-job training a difficult sell. What is it going to take us to sort of understand, or what does it mean to sort of roll that back, and what kind of public policies might support it? I hope WorkRise would get into that. I'd love to learn that and be able to be a part of that process.
Peter?
Yeah, I feel so enriched having the opportunity to hear from all of my co-panelists here. I feel like I'm getting smarter just by listening to you, and just building on the comments that you've all shared here. I think that a really integral role that WorkRise could play is bringing folks together who otherwise might want to compete with each other, and saying what are the areas where we can collaborate without sacrificing the bottom line, right? Or even saying like, how much of the bottom line are we willing to sacrifice in order to collaborate for the broader good, to David's point. In moments of crisis, and I'm going to kind of harken back to, you know, how Parag opened us up with the book from Francis Perkins. That's a time when we all pull together, right? We all forget what our party affiliations are. We all forget what states we're from and race and all of these other things. And we really say, how can we all pull together as people who are kind of like connected by the same, like, and I think that that is going to be really important in this moment, because, you know, what is good for the entire ecosystem is going to support the entire economy for like all of the employers, right? Because your workers are somebody else's consumers, their consumers are somebody else's workers. And what I would like to see is WorkRise really say, how can we bring together a multilateral framework that allows folks who might otherwise want to compete figure out like where do they fit in and like pitch in and collaborate.
Appreciate that, Peter. We have a ton of great questions flowing in. I'm trying to read and speak at the same time. It's definitely testing my skill level. But I want to start with one here, which I think is a really important one. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit long, but basically for folks, especially those that have been laid off or hard hit by COVID, have lost jobs, particularly thinking about the hospitality industry, often have very transferable skills, but perhaps there is a perception that in order to find work again, they need to go back to a training program or need to go back to school when in fact there are jobs open. And so I just want to get each of your perspective on, and I think this goes back, Kristen, to the language you used about a pathway problem, which is hopefully there's some agency for those individuals in making a choice between pursuing further education to ultimately find an alternative career path or going right back into work. But I think the question implies that the assumption is the only way to get back into work is to go through training. Can you just comment on that? Sort of what do you see right now in terms of that? Don't all jump in at once.
Were you asking, Kristen, or because if not, I'm happy to share a quick thought.
Please. Oh, yeah, no, Mary Alice, jump in.
No, I think this, we're all concerned about sort of permanent job losses in certain sectors, particularly obviously hospitality and retail, I think are big areas of concern. I do think as we think about the recovery, we need to think about the need for the federal government and state governments to get into the business of job creation. We are going to lose jobs. We need to create new jobs in it. And one of the big lessons from the Great Recession was that we depended on private sector job creation in order to bring in the new jobs. And it did happen. It just took 8 years for it to happen. And that's a long time, and people suffered a lot. And there was a lot of suffering because of that. There is a role to go back to the Great Depression and go back to the programs that were implemented there for the federal government to play in creating good new jobs. We certainly need jobs in the care sector, and this would be a historic opportunity for the federal government to also raise the quality of the jobs in the care sector. We have a need to address climate change. There's real opportunities there to do some job creation. This doesn't all have to be public sector jobs. It can be private sector job creation indirectly through things like infrastructure investments in the care economy, investments in climate change mitigating effects. But I think we need to think beyond just sort of getting people into jobs that are going to sort of slowly come back, and actually think about a job creation strategy and what role the federal government can play in partnership with the private sector to do that.
Yeah,
go ahead, David, please.
First, last time. Go ahead, Kristen. Go ahead.
You're so kind. I love this question, and I love what you just shared, Mary. I would add a couple points specific to the facts provided. A hospitality worker is traditionally identified today as a low wage, low skilled worker. And we think about what's happened over the last 6 months as an example. If you think about who has been on the front lines, rewriting their own job descriptions, coming up with creative solutions to challenges that no one has before seen, it's those frontline workers. And those are skills that employers are looking for. And this brings me back to Peter's work with Opportunity at Work, which we funded as well, really looking at how do we help workers better articulate their skills and marry that with what employers are, because those skills I just mentioned are absolutely paramount to any employer operating in today's landscape. But when they see this framed as this is a hospitality worker, that translates as low wage. And I think this, again, gets back to some of these systemic challenges, but no, I don't think training is absolutely necessary.
What I was going to add, in San Antonio, this is real time happening as we speak. It's a perfect example. So in our economy, we have a very strong hospitality, tourism-based economy with other features to it. We've lost our hospitality or restaurant workers somewhere in the neighborhood. We have about 250,000 that were dislocated as a result of the pandemic. The vast majority of those were in the hospitality industry. And what's interesting, and just as we talk about it kind of in a generic or commodity type sense, but each person in that industry has a story, has a background. And in the hospitality industry, you're talking about a wide spectrum of people that may have college degrees, on their way to a college degree or working. So what we're learning here in San Antonio, that as we are working with those folks, is giving them a place to navigate and assess what pivot point they want. Some individuals may choose to want to go back where the opportunity is into a hospitality-based job. But those that want to pivot or have some form of already transferable skills, helping them navigate the broader system about maybe an on-the-job training avenue is right for them. So serving as a clearinghouse, and this is happening, and this is what we're doing right now, is serving as a clearinghouse to give individuals access to the information so they can make the right decision for themselves, and then helping them assess which form of those transferable skills could be reapplied in a different situation. So the things I was mentioning earlier, we're actually putting into practice in our community to create that, at least that end-to-end navigation, so people can understand where they're at, help them assess what their skill sets are, what they want to do, and where the opportunities are. So when we talk about those, you're right, they're kind of equated as maybe a low-wage worker. But when you peel that back for a second and really work with the people, you're covering a broad spectrum of individuals with different barriers and different challenges and different skill sets and different educational levels. And you have to kind of work them on a case-by-case basis, but yet have that offering or portfolio of services to help them then figure out what's right for them. And that's what our learning is, and we're living that, as I said, here right now in San Antonio.
Appreciate that, David. Peter?
And if I can just add something to what Kristen said too, that this is exactly the motivation behind our research work, which is really to say that when you do a job, there are certain skills that that job requires. And so if we can look at a person as being skilled based on their work experience, that would help us to understand what skills they bring to the table. And then in terms of looking at the transferability of those skills, we can say, well, what are the skills that are required for other jobs? And then look at how close, or like in like a skill distance sense, is one job to another job. And what our algorithm does is it allows you to really identify some non-obvious like job transitions where like employers may not necessarily be looking for workers from that particular background, but if you look at it based on just the skills themselves, that worker actually is skilled to do that work. And so that's a huge part of what we're doing, because training is expensive in terms of time and money, right? And especially in a pandemic when you need to put food on the table, like you may not have time to go back to college or to do something like that. And because technology is evolving so rapidly, oftentimes training is depreciating over time too, because what you learn today becomes obsolete tomorrow. I'll add one other quick comment too, is I think that there's also a moment for us to be like a lot more creative during this moment. So I have cousins who, like, the moment that the pandemic hit, started sewing masks. And like one cousin, like she was just sewing so many masks that she said, I've not had so many opportunities as I do like right now too. And so I think we have to really find a way to encourage a lot more entrepreneurship. I will kind of like go out on a limb with the hospitality example as a way of revealing my background, having grown up in the Bahamas, which is a country that is predicated on hospitality and has been, you know, tremendously hit by COVID-19 and Hurricane Dorian prior to this. A huge gap right now is many workers who want to go back to work can't because they don't have access to childcare. And many childcare facilities are not open. And many hotels don't have people in them. So what if some enterprising hotel thought, what if we can think about repurposing our facilities to create some kind of like a childcare facility where we use our workers and like bring folks into this place. You have the rooms so you can do appropriately like social distancing and like all of these other things too. A lot of hotels are in downtown areas, and so if parents are working in the central business district, they can pop in and see their kid like over lunch. And let's start to think really creatively about how we repurpose like both people and both spaces. To Kristen's point, thinking about the transferability of those skills, and then also seeing the voids that this crisis has created as being kind of like blank canvases for us to kind of like reimagine something different. And I think if we're able to say, how can we allow this crisis to give us an opportunity to dream bigger and to reimagine, if we can create that kind of a creativity, in my estimation, that may be even more important than the building up of knowledge, right? Because that creativity is something that can sustain you whenever the facts on the ground and the situation changes in a very fluid way.
Appreciate that, Peter. One of the questions that came through, which is one of my favorite questions to talk to people about ever, so we're going to pull it forward, is where have you failed in this work? And what can we on the panel or in the audience learn from that failure?
I'll go on a limb and talk about that. And I'm not sure if it's the word.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
But what and again, I have been in this work for the last 3 years, so I'm still, I would say, learning, but I don't know if it's a failure or a challenge, but being able to articulate the value proposition in a way that people can see that workforce development and these type of scenarios do have a return on investment to the community. And so I think if I can use the word failure, and that's not the word I really would, is to articulate that in the right way where it's a compelling case that says, oh yes, this is exactly what we should be doing. I see the other side of that. I see more challenges about maybe skepticism about the outcomes or the benefits of the return on investment. So the failure may be just in a general sense is how do we make sure that we can articulate through measurement and through other outcomes the value proposition, the return on investment, so it's compelling for businesses to step in. And if you want to even use the philanthropic community, I just think there's still a challenge that I see of being able to make the solid business case for the investment and the return on investment. And I think there's an opportunity there to refine that thinking and make it more of a compelling story where everybody does want to align that system and get involved in programs and processes to upskill workers.
Appreciate that, David. Thank you for going first on that question. Who else has got an answer? You don't all have to answer. That was.
Oh, Peter, please.
No, Kristen, you go ahead.
I'll simply allude to something I mentioned earlier, which is I think all too often, those of us in workforce development do think about this work in terms of educational attainment. How do we get someone through a training program with a degree, with a credential? And again, you know, the notion that right now we're going to ask populations, we're going to ask me, I myself cannot give you 4 years, 2 years, 6 months. The notion that that is the answer is completely flawed. And we have to find a better solution. And there are plenty of ways to do that, but we have to reframe our thinking because those types of investments will no longer work.
Thanks for that, Kristen. Peter?
Yeah, I think that one potential missed opportunity early in the pandemic, which I hope we can correct, was this kind of like rush for everybody to secure themselves. I will talk about like the role of universities because I've spent so much of my life in universities. I think the natural reaction really was, you know, how do we make sure and protect the health of the university itself, which I think was very important and was very well done. I think that we are centers of learning and we have people who are epidemiologists, people who are sociologists or economists, and there are ways in which I believe that universities could have and should have earlier on in the crisis be thinking in a very comprehensive way about how we as an entire ecosystem are responding to this crisis, right? Because there are some things that we still have to learn in terms of like, how does in-person classes work? And it's been nice that some schools have gone in person, some have done hybrid, some have done completely remote. And the hope is that we can all like pull together and say, what did we learn from this across the board and how can we implement that going forward? So there's that collaboration within the sector. And again, I'm speaking about universities because that's my home. And then there's the second piece about what is it that we can do for the broader society. So when you think about us opening up, I think that universities are uniquely positioned to open up because for those of us that have like hospitals and that have like very serious clinics on campus, in some sense, we could really model what it looks like to practice the right sorts of like social distancing and the right sorts of like hygiene etiquette, to practice the right sorts of like rapid testing and best practices that can then be extended to places in the private sector where they may not have the same like breadth of experts across several domains and also the facilities to be able to test in the way that we can. The NBA was a really great example of an institution that handled the crisis personally for itself really well, developed a model that was really scalable and really demonstrated like to the rest of the world that this is something that can be done. And so, you know, my hope is that this isn't something that's a permanent failure, but this is really something where we could kind of like come together and learn from each other going forward.
Appreciate that. Mary Alice, you want to share an example?
Yeah, I guess my example, again, I would just say, again, we have for years now failed to communicate the importance of thinking about worker power and worker organization as something that our whole economy will benefit from. And that part of the reason our economy is not inclusive and is not generating the kind of economic growth that we want, and perhaps part of the reason that we do have so much division and polarization right now, is that we just have historic levels of inequality, and that we're not going to solve these through individually oriented strategies of educational attainment or skills training. We have to start thinking about more solidaristic and collective approaches to sort of economic development and economic growth. And I think we just gotten to a place in the United States where for years we've just gotten so used to thinking of, in individualistic terms and in market terms, and that anything that interferes with the market is necessarily going to be bad. And the reality is we're holding ourselves back by our failure to sort of support workers, support worker organization, and support worker power. And it's a big failure because our counterpart countries, in Europe and other places are doing much better and are getting through the pandemic much better, in part because they have the social insurance systems they need, they have the worker organizations they need, and they're gonna come out of this much faster than we are. So it's a failure, I think, I'm coming from here to Peter talking about universities, I'm coming from the think tank world in terms of how we help people understand our broad shared interests as a country and what it takes to get to where we want to go. We need to work harder at that.
I appreciate that. We're super tight on time, but I'm going to squeeze one more question in. There's several questions folks have asked that sort of, I think, are at the nexus of worker power or worker agency relative to choices about labor market, right? So it's very easy to say we're going to pull in the AI algorithms and they're going to tell us what people should go and do. Only problem is people may not want to go and do that. And so as we close out, you guys can just give some comment to what is or ought to be, or how do you think about the role of individual worker identity in the context of job matching and skills training? And this will be our last question because I'm seeing that clock tick tock. Keep these answers relatively short. And Peter, can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. I think technology has an incredibly important role to play. I think we still will need the human element. A great example of this is when you look at algorithmic bias. You pop in like a search for African American and you might not see a person, you might see an animal, right? And so in some sense, what happens when we defer too much to technology is we can actually push discrimination further into the background and then manifest inequality. We might not think that it's a systemic issue. And so we need both the human element and also technology as we go forth, and not seeing technology as a be all and end all.
Appreciate that. Mary Alice, you want to go next?
Again, I would just emphasize again, technology is critically important, and it can be, it's going to be with us, and we need to think about how to deploy it around increasing all of our welfare, but we can't take for granted that it will always benefit everyone. It can, in fact, exacerbate inequality. I will say it's doing that right now. We need robust, when we think about the future of work and the effects of automation, we need robust public policies that are human-centered. And we have choices to make, and we can make those choices, and we should do them always, again, putting human dignity and fairness and solidarity at the center of those decisions.
Appreciate that. David?
I would just say that you don't know what you don't know. And from a worker standpoint, we don't put that mirror up. So I'll take a different tact and say it's about people understanding their true skills and strengths. And there's different ways of you can frame that. But I think giving some people that insight and perspective of how best to apply what their God-given talents are through different ways is key. The technology and the opportunities will certainly be there, but how do they navigate and where do they find their true North Star? And giving the opportunity to create those insights and understanding of their skills and strengths and apply, and then they can figure out where they could apply those things. I think that's kind of like putting the mirror up first and providing that framework as a starting point.
Thank you, David. Kristen?
I'll do this quickly, but I think we're all a little bit guilty of this, including today. You know, workers have an important voice here, if not the most important voice. And when we think about programs we've built, I don't know how many sessions I've sat in on building technologies to help workers navigate this. I would love to challenge us to have a job seeker at the table. not only in this Zoom, but in designing these systems. Let's have the voice of the person we're hoping to solve this problem for represented and built into what we hope to be the solution for all.
I can't think of a better note to end on than that. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. I could keep going for like another hour, but we are at our time. Thank you for your engagement today, and thank you to each one of the panelists. And please do continue to follow along on the launch of the WorkRise journey over the next couple of days. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.